Sarah Vance thought she had been erased from her grandmother's will. Her aunt took the estate, her cousin got the offshore accounts, her brother received the stock portfolio, and Sarah got nothing. But just as her family began celebrating, the lawyer pulled out a second envelope sealed with her grandmother's crest. Inside was a brass key, an old ledger, and one strange condition. Sarah had to survive 30 days alone in a frozen cottage. Her family laughed, thinking it was a punishment. They had no idea it was the beginning of their legal destruction.
I am Sarah Vance, 30 years old. Last Tuesday I sat in a freezing law firm in Salem, Oregon, watching my aunt smirk as the lawyer read my grandmother's final will. My cousins got the cash, the land, and the jewelry. My aunt grabbed the massive lakeside estate. My cousin Jade snagged the offshore accounts, while my brother Liam took the stock portfolio. I was the only one who visited Grandma for the last 5 years, yet my name never came up. My aunt leaned over the mahogany desk, sneered at my worn jacket, and told me I was finally getting what I deserved. But she had no idea. The lawyer held a second envelope in his bag. And what was inside that package cost my family every cent they thought they had won. Before I reveal what the lawyer pulled out, welcome to Legacy Lies. Subscribe if you believe in true loyalty. Drop a comment with your age and state. I read them all. Now, back to that mahogany desk, and the moment my aunt thought she erased me. The wall clock ticked with a slow, steady pulse. It was the only sound. Outside, an autumn storm battered the glass, turning the view of the Willamette River into a grey blur. Inside, the room smelled of old coffee and dry paper. Mr. Henderson sat at the head of the table, turning a heavy page in his leather file. "To my daughter Brenda," he read. His voice was flat, devoid of warmth. "I leave the primary estate in Bend, including the main house, the surrounding acreage, and all property improvements." Brenda let out a breath she had been holding since we walked in. Her polished nails, which had been tapping a nervous beat against the oak, finally stilled. She smoothed a crease in her cream cashmere sweater. As a vintage clothing expert, I noticed the fabric's stiff, synthetic drape. It was fake, just like her to my granddaughter Jade. Henderson continued, "I leave the contents of the offshore liquid accounts. Jade didn't look up from her phone, just checked her lighting in the reflection. To my grandson, Liam," Henderson added. I watched my brother shift. He refused to meet my eyes, staring at a brass weight on the desk. "I leave the domestic stock portfolio and the remaining commercial real estate shares." Henderson finished. Liam swallowed hard, giving a tight nod. Henderson closed the file. The thud echoed in the room. He folded his hands. That was it. My name had not been spoken. I sat still, listening to the clock. I didn't feel the sting of rejection. I felt a cold, sharp clarity. Beatrice, my grandmother, had raised me. I knew her better than anyone here. She didn't make oversights. She made plans. Brenda broke the silence with a sigh of fake pity, turning to look at me. "Well," she said, her voice coated in sugar, "I know this is tough, Sarah, but Mother was always a pragmatist. You chose a quirky hobby over a real career. She knew you wouldn't know how to handle capital. It is for the best." Liam flinched but stayed quiet. Jade finally locked her screen, offering a thin, rehearsed smile. "We will send you some knickknacks from the house," Brenda added. She stood up to claim her victory, a vase or one of her old quilts for your collection. She reached for her coat. "Sit down, Brenda." Henderson had not raised his voice. The command was soft, yet it sucked the air right out of the room. Brenda froze, hand hovering near her collar. Henderson reached into his briefcase and withdrew a thick, weathered envelope. The red wax seal bore Grandma's personal crest. "The main will is concluded," Henderson said, looking at me for the first time. However, I was told to wait until the primary gifts were formally accepted. He broke the wax seal. The sharp snap echoed louder than the clock. "There is a second document." He held the envelope up. The room's mood shifted from triumphant to fragile. Brenda lowered her arm. Her synthetic sweater suddenly looked like a cheap costume. Henderson slid a letter opener through the paper. The sound was a sharp tear that made Liam flinch. He pulled out 2 items and placed them on the mahogany table with deliberate care. The first was a heavy tarnished brass key. The metal bore the dark patina of age, the grooves worn smooth by years of use. The second was a thick, worn leather ledger bound by a small brass lock. Henderson didn't smile. He looked at us like a surgeon delivering a diagnosis. "This is not an addition to the estate," Henderson stated, tapping his pen on the ledger. "This is a separate, binding, contractual condition. Beatrice established a blind trust independent of the court. Access to it is tied to this key." Brenda let out a sharp, breathless laugh. "A blind trust? Mother hated trusts. What is in it?" Henderson ignored her. He looked only at me. "Sarah, your grandmother outlined a specific residency clause. To inherit whatever is secured by this key, you must live in the small Weaver S cottage on the edge of the Bend property. You must live there alone for 30 consecutive days. You cannot accept any outside financial help. If you leave for even one night, the contract is voided and the trust dissolves." Brenda laughed louder. Jade looked up, confused. Liam kept his eyes on the table, a muscle pulsing in his jaw. "The Weaver's cottage," Brenda sneered, her confidence rushing back. "She means that miserable shack in the woods, the one with drafty floorboards and the ancient stone hearth." "Sarah, mother isn't giving you an inheritance. She is giving you a chore. She is punishing you for playing with old rags." Jade smirked, sliding her phone into her bag. 30 days without heat. "Have fun freezing to death, cousin." I didn't respond to their taunts. I kept my eyes on the table and rested my fingertips against the ledger. The leather was stiff and brittle. As I ran my thumb over the binding, a faint scent rose from the pages. Peppermint oil and old paper. It was Grandma. It was the exact smell of her private study, the room where she taught me to authenticate historical documents. My heart gave a rhythmic thump. This wasn't a punishment. Beatrice never acted out of spite. She acted out of strategy. The cottage was isolated. She was removing me from the noise of the family, giving me a place to focus. She was giving me an assignment. I looked at Henderson. "I accept the terms." He gave a curt nod and pushed the key and ledger toward me. "The 30-day clock starts at sundown." I dropped the items in a canvas tote and walked out of the office without a backward glance. The cold air hit my lungs like ice. The storm had intensified, blanketing the streets in thick white. I climbed into my Subaru. The engine coughed and rattled before finally starting. I cranked the heater to the max, but it only blew lukewarm air against the frozen windshield. The drive to Bend took over an hour in the mounting snow. The roads wound through dense forests of bare maples and pines. The slap of the wipers served as a metronome for my racing thoughts. I pictured Grandma in her study, sipping tea, calculating this exact scenario. Beatrice didn't build a legacy by leaving things to chance. If she left a locked ledger, it held the answers. If she demanded, "I stay in the cottage," she knew those thick walls provided something the main house could not protection. Secrecy. I knew the cottage well. It was built in the 18th century, a rare relic from the original land claim that predated our family's arrival in Oregon. Grandma spent a fortune preserving its structure while refusing to modernize it. It had no central heat, no hot water, and a roof pitched steep enough to shed heavy snow. But I knew it had a functional stone hearth water from a deep spring and shelves full of oil lamps because of my work. I spent my days analyzing the weave and fiber durability of colonial textiles. I understood the reality of historical living. I was ready. I knew how those cottage owners survived brutal winters. I could manage. But turning onto the private lane to the estate, my gut twisted. The snow was untouched, a perfect sheet of white. My Subaru tires spun wild before the all-wheel drive grabbed hold. I crested the hill and saw the cottage outline. Then I jammed the brakes, the car fish-tailed anti-lock brakes grinding against ice. I slid to a stop inches from a polished metal wall. Parked sideways, blocking the path, was a pristine black SUV, Cynthia's car. She hadn't taken it to the office, she had sent it here. The SUV was wedged between two oaks, a total barrier, no way around. The banks dropped into a jagged ravine. I left the engine running and stepped into the bitter wind. The cold stung my skin. I trudged through knee-deep snow to the barrier, wiping frost from the window. I peered inside, empty. The keys were gone. Cynthia had trapped me, long before Julian opened that envelope. She knew the trust conditions, or she guessed Beatrice's final move by blocking the road, she was forcing a legal default. If I couldn't reach the property line by sunset, or if I left to get to tow, the 30-day residency clause would void the contract. I stood in the swirling white. The sun dipped behind the trees, casting long shadows. Less than an hour left. Cynthia thought a locked car and freezing mountain would break me. She thought I was just the quiet niece who sold old blankets. My fingers gripped the brass key in my pocket. I killed the ignition. The Subaru went silent, leaving only the wind howling through the pines. Cynthia thought her luxury vehicle was an impenetrable fortress. She figured I would sit there, watch my gas gauge fall, and crawl back to Burlington. She didn't know my stubborn streak. I slung my bag over my shoulder, pulled my collar tight, and stepped into the drifts. My boots crunched hard into the frozen crust. The temp dropped as the sun vanished. Pine branches snapped under the ice. My lungs burned, but I kept my eyes on the path. 20 minutes of grueling climbing later, the dark silhouette of the cottage finally appeared. Built 3 centuries ago, it was a sturdy, survivalist structure. Steep roof for snow, narrow windows for heat, and weathered cedar shingles. I stepped onto the porch and stamped the ice from my boots. My numb fingers found the old iron key hidden under a floorboard. The deadbolt groaned, but the door swung wide. I entered, hitting the light switch. Nothing. I flipped it again. Still pitch black. No power. Dread tightened my chest. I went outside to the utility meter on the side of the house. The thick conduit pipe feeding from the main line was hanging loose. The rubber was sliced cleanly, exposing the copper wiring. A yellow tag flapped in the wind with a local contractor logo. It read, "Winterization Disconnect, authorized by Cynthia Hall." She hadn't just blocked the road, she had weaponized the Vermont winter. She knew the clause banned outside financial help. Hiring an electrician on a holiday weekend would be too expensive and break the contract terms. She wanted me frozen out by midnight. I went inside, locking the door against the storm. Total darkness. I felt my way along the walls until my hands touched the cold stone hearth. I found the hurricane lamp and a box of matches. I struck one, the sulphur head flaring to life. The spark bloomed into a steady orange flame. I lit the wick and golden light flooded the room, pushing back shadows. It illuminated the floor, revealing Beatrice's antique loom, a magnificent oak machine. It stood tall, a silent testament to the past. The sight calmed my racing pulse. I was an appraiser. I knew how to handle historical artifacts. Now I just had to live in one. But I needed heat. I checked the hearth. It was empty. The kindling bin was just dust. Cynthia had cleared out the firewood. It was freezing inside. Without a fire, I wouldn't last the night. I wondered how many floorboards I could burn before a low rumble shook the ground. Not whined a diesel engine. I wiped the window. Headlights swept through the blizzard. A heavy-duty truck plowed straight over the brush and snowbanks, ignoring the roadblock entirely. It rumbled to a stop near the porch. The door swung open and a woman stepped into the storm. Maya, my brother Athanesque's wife. She was a brilliant architect from Boston who designed high-rise load-bearing frameworks. She had a mind for finding structural weaknesses. She had always been skeptical of my Aunt Cynthia's fake, leveraged lifestyle. I threw the door open. Maya trudged up the stairs with foil-wrapped thermal blankets. "You are freezing," she said, pushing past me. "What are you doing here?" I asked, shutting out the wind. "Ethan told you to stay out of this." She dropped the blankets. "Ethan says a lot of things," he said. "Cynthia was being practical with that roadblock," she scoffed. "I know this storm, and I know your aunt. She doesn't play fair." She went back to her truck and hauled in 2 bags of seasoned birchwood and cedar. She dumped them on the hearth. "He forbade you from helping," I said, watching her stack the wood with precision. "If Cynthia finds out, she will punish him." Maya struck a match and tossed it in. The cedar caught instantly, sending heat into the room. She brushed off her gloves. Her eyes were steady. "Ethan lets fear dictate his loyalty," she said softly. "Blood makes you related, but showing up when the power lines are cut, that makes you family. Cynthia thinks she can bully you out of this inheritance." I am not letting her win on a technicality. Maya's courage was a sharp contrast to my brother's. Cowardice, she was risking her marriage for me. I can't pay you for this wood, I warned. The contract forbids financial help. Think of this as a housewarming gift, Maya said, zipping her coat. I have to leave. If I stay, they will claim you were not alone. Keep the fire stoked, lock the doors. I watched from the window as her truck carved a path through the snow, her taillights vanishing into the whiteout. The cabin was as alive now. The hearth roared, soaking the thick stones with heat. The warmth slowly seeped into my frozen limbs. I walked to the table, shed my coat, and sat on the bench. From my bag I pulled out the heavy leather ledger and the brass key. The firelight danced over the cracked cover. As the material warmed, the sharp scent of peppermint oil filled the room. I slid the key into the small padlock. The internal mechanism shifted with a heavy, satisfying click. The lock sprang open. I lifted the cover, expecting a standard diary or perhaps a letter about the will, maybe some final words or a half-hearted apology. What I found stole the air from my lungs. The parchment was not filled with personal musings. It was ruled into precise columns of dates, names, interest rates, and staggering dollar amounts. Beside these figures, written in her signature slanted cursive, were meticulous annotations in striking red ink. It was a secret ledger, a master record of every hidden transaction, every favor leveraged, and every broken promise. As I traced the red ink, the truth hit me. My grandmother had not left me an empty inheritance. She had handed me a loaded weapon. Birch logs hissed in the hearth, spitting embers against the brick. I sat at the table, the kerosene lamp casting a golden glow over the open pages. The room smelled of wood smoke, melting frost, and that biting, medicinal tang of peppermint rising from the old paper. I ran my finger down the first column. Grandmother had a penmanship from a lost era. Her cursive was perfect, mathematical, and written in a stark black ink that cut through the parchment. As a professional appraiser, I spent my career authenticating history. I knew how to look at the evidence to spot a fake. My family, I quickly saw, was a collection of frauds. Grandmother was not just some lonely widow tending to her roses. She was the secret bankroll for every relative who had sneered at me in the boardroom. I turned the page. The header read, Cynthia Hall, Luxury Imports. My aunt had spent a decade building an image as a self-made titan. She gave keynote speeches and bragged to magazines about her business genius. The ledger told a much different story. Cynthia had not built an empire. She had built a house of cards on her mother's dime. Line after line showed massive wire transfers, $50,000 for payroll, $100,000 for a storefront lease. But it was the margins that floored me. She had kept a moral accounting too. My finger stopped at the bottom, where the black ink turned into a harsh, unforgiving red. I read the note aloud, my voice ringing in the dark cabin. April 14th. Wired $200,000 to save Cynthia's margins. Asked her to stay for tea. She claimed her driver was waiting. The tea went cold. 8% interest applied. It hit me hard. I stared at the red ink until the letters blurred. I remembered that day. I remembered pulling into the estate and seeing Cynthia speeding away. I remembered walking in to find grandmother sitting alone at the island, staring at 2 cold, untouched cups of tea. The weight of the ledger felt like the ground shifting under me. This was not just financial ruin. It was an itemized receipt of an old woman's profound loneliness. Cynthia took the cash to save her vanity project, then could not spare 15 minutes for the mother who rescued her. Grandmother had penalized her for the cruelty, quietly adding interest to the debt of a broken heart. I flipped the page. Ethan. My brother played the part of the savvy developer, driving sports cars and wearing tailored suits. According to the ledger, his last 3 property flips were entirely funded by grandmother. When a contractor walked off the job, she paid the settlement. When a foundation cracked and the bank threatened foreclosure, she wired the bailout. Then there was Chloe, my cousin. She posed as a global influencer, posting photos from Dubai and Paris. The ledger showed those trips were not sponsored by brands. They were funded by emergency cash requests sent to her grandmother. I found a $20,000 transfer for a yacht in the Mediterranean. The red ink simply noted, that Chloe called in tears about her image. I paid the captain, did not receive a thank you note. They were parasites. They drained her wealth for their own vanity, then mocked me for my work. Grandmother had watched it all happen. She kept the receipts, locked them away, and handed me the key. She gave me the sword to cut through their lies. My phone buzzed, shattering the silence. It rattled on the table, the screen casting a harsh blue glow. Cynthia's name flashed on the display. I checked the time past midnight. Outside, the storm was still throwing ice against the windows. I swiped the screen. "I didn't say a word. Megan," Cynthia said, her voice dripping with fake concern. "I am so glad you have a signal. I have been worrying about you." I watched the firelight hit the red ink. "Did you hire someone to cut the power lines?" I asked. Cynthia let out a dismissive sigh. That was scheduled maintenance. "Listen, sweetheart. I know you want to prove a point, but the temperature is dropping. That shack is an icebox. You will get sick, playing pioneer. I am perfectly warm," I replied, my voice steady. Cynthia ignored me. "I want to help, Megan. I will write you a personal check for $10,000. Pack your bags, come down the mountain, and stay at the lodge. You can start a little shop. You do not need to suffer for some blind trust that probably only has a few old bonds." She was fishing. She needed to know if I had opened the book. She needed to know if I held the power. I closed the leather cover, the padlock clicking against the wood. "I don't need your money, Cynthia. I am staying for the month." The fake warmth vanished. The silence on the line turned sharp and hostile. "You are an arrogant, ungrateful girl," Cynthia spat, her facade finally breaking. "You think you are better than us?" I was trying to be generous to my sister's child. "You were trying to buy a default," I corrected her. Cynthia breathed heavily. "You want to play hardball? Fine. That cottage is not up to code. It lacks basic heating and sanitation. I am calling a judge first thing in the morning. I am going to have that property condemned. The sheriff will drag you off that mountain by noon. Enjoy your last night in the cold, Megan." The line went dead. I set the phone down. The war had begun. Cynthia thought this was just a property battle. She had no idea I was sitting in the dark, armed with the exact numbers to dismantle her entire world. I tossed another log on the fire and waited for dawn. The 5th day broke clear and bitter. Cynthia never sent the sheriff. The local offices were slow in winter, and even my aunt could not bribe a judge over a holiday weekend. She realized the legal grind was too slow. They wanted me broken now. If they couldn't freeze me out, they would starve me out. The target shifted from Cynthia to my cousin. Chloe began her campaign from her fancy Boston penthouse. It started Tuesday. My phone, resting on the dining table, buzzed against the wood. Then it went wild. A relentless storm of alerts hit my screen. I opened my inbox. My best clients, museum curators, and top textile collectors, everyone were turning their backs on me. Subject lines read like obituaries for my career. Cancellations, doubts about my work, urgent questions. The Boston Historical Society dropped me. Their director cited a wave of disturbing reports online that questioned my professional integrity. I checked my business profile. My 5-star rating had cratered to a 1. Overnight, dozens of anonymous trolls posted brutal reviews. They claimed I faked colonial fabrics, took kickbacks for appraisals, and scammed elderly folks out of family heirlooms. Chloe owned a digital empire, millions of followers, bot networks, and peer experts trained to manipulate algorithms. She turned that whole machine against me just to wreck my livelihood. In the small world of antique textiles, your reputation is everything. One rumor of fraud is a death sentence. Chloe was flooding the market with lies. My phone chimed again. Another cancellation. I stood in my cottage, the cold air biting, trying to hold back the panic. If the business died, I would be broke. When I finally left this mountain, they wanted me to panic and abandon the residency clause to save my firm. I put the phone face down. I refused to let Chloe control my heart rate. I needed something real. My eyes landed on a quilt. Beatrice had hung up, a mid-19th century trapunto piece. It is a complex style where stitches outline patterns, and yarn or batting is stuffed inside to make them pop in 3 dimensions. It was a feather wreath design with a beautiful indigo border. I walked over, tracing the raised feathers with my fingers. Usually, the texture calmed me, but as I ran my hand along the edge, my trained eye spotted something wrong. The quilt front was a genuine antique, the cotton worn soft by time, but the backing felt stiff. I stepped closer, tilting my lamp to see the seams better. The thread holding the layers together had a strange, artificial sheen. I squinted at the tiny loops. Authentic 19th century quilts use cotton or linen thread. This caught the light with a synthetic glare. It was nylon. Nylon did not exist back then. Also, the stitching was too perfect, clearly done by a machine. Beatrice was a total purist. She would never allow a cheap modern fix on a museum piece unless it served a hidden purpose. I grabbed my appraisal kit and pulled out a sharp seam ripper. I returned to the quilt and slid the blade under that synthetic thread. With one precise motion, I snapped the nylon. I worked my way along the edge, separating the antique front from the modern backing. As the seam popped, a corner of pale yellow paper peeked out from the batting. I gasped. This place was a fortress. Beatrice had turned her home into a vault. I reached into the hollow quilt and pulled out a thick manila folder. I opened it on the table under the lamp. The papers had nothing to do with antiques. It was a stack of legal agreements and settlement files. The first one was a cease and desist from a Brooklyn jewelry designer accusing Chloe Hall lifestyle brands of stealing her work. The designer claimed Chloe ripped off her necklace designs, mass-produced them overseas, and sold them as her own. Attached was a $50,000 settlement check signed by Beatrice. I kept digging. There were 6 settlements. Chloe's entire brand was built on lies. She was a serial plagiarist who stole from artists and used her grandmother to pay them off. Every agreement was countersigned by Beatrice, with angry red notes in the margins. Chloe begged for another bailout. Beatrice wrote just months before she died. She threatened to cut me off if I didn't pay the artist. The note said, "She is a hollow girl living a hollow life. Chloe was attacking me, not knowing." I now held the proof of her own fraud. If these secrets leaked, her brand would be finished. A lawsuit would destroy her overnight. My phone buzzed again. "Maya?" I picked up immediately. "Megan?" she said, her voice crackling on the weak connection. "Have you seen your business page?" "I am watching the reviews pour in," I said, keeping my voice steady. Maya took a breath. "I knew Cynthia couldn't pull this off, so I called a favor my firm's. It head owes me one. I had him trace the IP addresses hitting your page." "What did he find?" I asked, already guessing. "They are using proxy servers," Maya said, "but my guy is good." He traced the traffic straight back to a luxury condo in Boston Close building. "Exactly," Maya confirmed. "She hired a firm to nuke your reputation. I have the digital logs linking the attack to her private network. I can send the file." "Send it," I said. "Thank you, don't. Thank me yet," she warned. "This is just the start. Ethan and Cynthia are planning something too. Stay alert." "I will," I promised. I hung up and heard the file download finish. I had the digital trail linking Chloe to the smear campaign, and the paper trail proving she was a fraud. I grabbed the leather ledger, unlocked the padlock, and turned to the section on Chloe's offshore accounts. I picked up my pen under Beatrice's red notes. I added my own in black ink. I wrote down the date, the IP evidence, and the enders found in the quilt. The ledger wasn't just history anymore. It was an active weapon in this war. Chloe had fired her best shot. She didn't realize her own house was covered in gasoline, and I was holding the match. The attack was neutralized by the secrets hidden in these walls. I spent days in a quiet routine, ignoring the threats, waiting then. On the 11th morning, the wind died, and a weird, heavy silence fell over the woods. The snow stopped. I was by the hearth when I heard a distinct crunch on the porch, a heavy boot on the frozen wood. Someone had made it up the road, and they were standing right outside my door. The mountain went quiet after Chloe's smear campaign collapsed. The fake reviews stayed up, but that frantic digital assault just faded into the winter chill. Chloe retreated into the shadows, knowing her own corporate theft was one leak away from ruin. The silence wasn't peaceful, though. It felt like that eerie calm before a tsunami hits. They were just changing tactics. The second week was all about my brother, Silas. He always played the perfect peacemaker at family events. He wore sharp Italian suits, drove a high-end European sedan, and ordered top-shelf scotch with the confidence of a real estate mogul. But his entire success was a facade built entirely on Grandma's checkbook. Without her cash to cover his failed property deals, Silas was broke, and desperate men make dangerous moves. By day 15, I was deep into a brutal routine. Living in that old saltbox cabin meant constant physical work. Every morning I was outside, swinging a heavy iron maul against frozen logs to keep the fires burning. The rhythm kept me warm and focused. I actually left the front door unlocked while I worked, trusting the remote location and the steep road to keep strangers away. A bad mistake. After hauling a mountain of firewood inside, I tended the hearth. Once the cedar logs caught, I started checking the wide pine floorboards for loose spots. Grandma had layered the floors with heavy vintage rugs to block the drafts. One piece in the center of the room looked off. It was a mid-19th century hand-woven tapestry, dyed with deep indigo and vibrant madder roots that stained the wool for good. I knelt there, running my fingers over the complex, geometric patterns. Something felt loose underneath. The floor dipped when I pressed down. I rolled back the heavy rug, revealing the raw timber. One board didn't have the standard hand-forged nails like the others. I grabbed a screwdriver from my toolkit and jammed it into the seam. With one sharp twist, the plank popped right out. A shallow cavity was carved right into the subfloor. Inside, I found a thick black leather portfolio. I pulled it out to read by the firelight. This wasn't more of that moral ledger. It was a record of Silas and his private demons pages crammed with wire transfer receipts routed through anonymous shell companies in the Cayman Islands. Behind those were brutal collection notices from underground sports betting rings. The amounts were insane. He'd burned through hundreds of thousands in the last 4 years alone. Grandma had bailed him out twice, leaving red ink in the margins that detailed her total disgust with his lack of discipline. The recent bills were unpaid, and the interest was piling up. The syndicates were threatening to come for him. That was the real reason Silas accepted his share of the will without a fight. He needed that stock portfolio to liquidate right now, but even that wasn't enough. He needed us to sell the whole estate to developers so he could cash out before his creditors arrived. While I was uncovering his ruin by the fire, a different nightmare was unfolding outside. Silas had driven up, parking his sedan a half-mile down the road to keep the engine noise hidden. He was trudging through the snow, cornered and frantic. He assumed I was still out back at the woodpile. He crept onto the side porch with a steel pry bar tucked in his coat. He targeted the eastern window, planning to force the frozen sash and steal the key and the ledger. He totally underestimated the women in this family. Maya had driven up that afternoon to drop off groceries. She parked silently near the tree line, spotting fresh, hurried footprints leading up the path. She followed them. Just as Silas jammed that pry bar under the window frame, he shifted his weight to get leverage. His designer boot landed right on a rotted piece of antique trim. The old wood snapped instantly. That sharp crack sounded like a gunshot in the dead forest air. Silas froze. He turned his head slowly. Maya stood at the bottom of the porch steps holding a canvas grocery bag. She wasn't yelling. She just looked at him with cold, pure disgust. The big executive was shivering in the snow like a common thief, holding a crowbar against his own grandmother's home. Maya didn't raise her voice. She spoke with a quiet precision that cut deep. She told him to drop the tool. He stammered, his breath puffing in the air, trying to spin some pathetic lie about checking the house for drafts. Maya dropped the grocery bag into the snow. She said his name, her voice flat and hard. She told him he was trying to rob his own sister because he was drowning in debt. I heard them through the thin glass. I walked to the window and looked out. I watched my brother drop the steel bar. It hit the snow with a thud and vanished. His shoulders slumped, that whole facade of a successful man just collapsing inward. Maya turned her back on him. She walked up the stairs, stepped around him like he was trash, and knocked on the door. I unlatched the deadbolt and let her in. Silas stayed on the porch for a long, painful minute before turning back down the mountain, leaving a trail of pathetic footprints behind. Maya stood by the fire, unwinding her scarf. Her hands were shaking. It wasn't the cold, it was the moment she realized her marriage was a total lie. The man she married was a ghost. I handed her the black portfolio I had just found. She opened it. I watched her dark eyes scan the offshore receipts and those terrifying threats. The final illusion of her husband died right there in the smoke. He wasn't a businessman. He was a parasite willing to destroy his own sister just to save his own skin. Maya closed the folder. She stared into the flames, her jaw set with a new, dangerous resolve. She whispered that he would call the estate lawyers the moment he hit his car. He was desperate, and desperate men make reckless deals. If he couldn't steal the ledger, they would try to take the land by force. We had to call Julian. Cynthia was going to bring the law. The residency rules said I couldn't leave the house overnight, but nothing stopped a quick trip during the day to see a lawyer. I locked the heavy oak door of the cabin just after the sun came up. The storm had cleared, leaving the whole mountain covered in a blinding icy glaze. I steered my Subaru down the treacherous access road, my tires crunching over the frozen Prince Silas left the day before. I drove 20 miles past the main town to a stretch of highway. A diner sat near an old logging route, a faded metal building with a neon sign that buzzed like a hornet. The place smelled like burnt coffee and grease. Perfect for a secret meeting. Julian Pierce was waiting in a back booth. He wore a charcoal suit that looked completely out of place against the cracked red vinyl. Julian wasn't just a probate lawyer, he was a tactician. He'd spent the 80s as a corporate raider in Manhattan before moving to the mountains. Grandma hired him years ago for his ruthless take on asset protection. He treated corporate law like a surgeon treats a scalpel. He didn't do small talk. As I slid into the booth, he just folded his hands over a leather briefcase. He asked if I survived the 2 weeks. I told him I'd handled a smear campaign and a break-in attempt, keeping my voice low so the waitress wouldn't hear. I explained how Silas tried to pry the window open to steal the ledger. Julian didn't look surprised. He just said that desperation always leads to bad choices. He asked for the brass key. I reached into my coat and put the heavy, tarnished piece of metal on the table. I told him I'd opened the binder and read the moral debt ledger. I also found the hidden caches. Chloe signed Enders for stealing intellectual property, I told him. Silas was drowning in offshore syndicate debt. Grandma funded their whole lives. Julian picked up the key, turning it over in his palm. He corrected me, saying she funded their illusions, and she never gave away a single cent without securing her investment first. He clicked his briefcase open. He pulled out heavy legal folders instead of a notepad. That key, Julian explained, opens a vault at a regional bank in Burlington. As a state executor, I was authorized to pull these files once you confirmed you had the ledger. He flattened his hand on the top folder. The items you found under the floorboards are just emotional receipts. These are the corporate facts. He slid the first document over. The heavy, archival paper hissed as it skidded across the worn tabletop. Fluorescent lights hit the embossed state seal in the corner. I checked the header. Granite Holdings. Julian S. voice dropped. Your grandmother set up this trust 20 years ago. She didn't run a charity. When Cynthia wanted capital for her luxury brand, Beatrice didn't just write a blank check. She made Cynthia sign a pledge. When Ethan needed bailouts for his failing developments, Beatrice filed financing statements against his companies. I stared at the dense legal jargon covering the page. As an appraiser, I knew fabrics. Now I was reading corporate law. The implications hit me. A financing statement is a public lien. It puts creditors first if a debtor defaults. They aren't unsecured loans, I whispered. Exactly, Julian said. Beatrice secured every penny against their assets. She holds the liens on Cynthia's inventory, the equity in Chloe's condo, and voting rights in Ethan's properties. He leaned in as the new trustee. You don't just own their debt, you own their collateral. The diner sounds vanished. I sat there paralyzed by the weight of it all. I wasn't just some niece fighting for a drafty cottage. I was the majority stakeholder in their entire lives. Beatrice had built a hostile takeover and put me in charge. If you execute these liens, Julian noted, you can seize Cynthia's company. You can freeze her accounts. You can liquidate Ethan S. assets before his debts get him hurt. You can foreclose on Chloe S. entire lifestyle. You hold the nuclear codes to the Hall family empire. I touched the paper. The power was dizzying. Adrenaline surged as I thought of their sneers and insults. I wanted to drive to the main estate and evict them right now. Julian noticed my posture change. He pressed his hand over the documents and pulled them back. Not yet, he warned. Why not? I challenged. I have the proof. Because the trust is conditional, Julian stated. Granite Holding stays dormant until that 30-day residency clause is met. If you reveal these agreements now, Cynthia will file an emergency injunction. She'll tie you up in court for years. He snapped his briefcase shut. And if you fail to finish those final 15 days at the cottage, the trust dissolves and the assets go to charity. Cynthia, Ethan, and Chloe would walk away free. You'd lose everything. The trap snapped shut. I had to go back to that freezing cabin. They won't stop attacking me, I said, staring at the snow. Ethan failed. The smear campaign failed. Cynthia's running out of time to sell the estate. Julian nodded grimly. You were right. Ethan was a nuisance. Cynthia is a different threat. She plays for keeps and she will escalate. She'll move from petty games to real force. She might use the law or hired guards to drag you off that land. He stood up. Go back, Megan. Keep the fire burning. Stay locked in. Don't reveal the blade until it's against their throats. I watched Julian head out into the freezing Vermont air. I pocketed the brass key. It felt heavier. Now a weight of impending ruin. I drove back up the mountain under a grey sky. The forest silence felt like a threat. It felt like a held breath. Cynthia thought she was fighting a peasant for a piece of land. She was about to play her final card, and I had to brace for the hit. The Vermont mountain air was dangerously quiet. While I sat in my cabin, waiting out the clock, the family's ruin was detonating 50 miles away. The collapse started in the sleek kitchen of Ethan and Mayer's downtown condo. Mayer arrived late. She didn't even take off her coat. She walked to the marble island, unzipped her bag, and pulled out the black portfolio I'd found. Ethan was sitting there with a bourbon, scrolling through real estate listings. He looked up, expecting his wife to comfort him. He saw the black folder instead. Maya didn't yell. She just laid the documents on the cold marble. Wire receipts, collection notices, interest calculations. Ethan stared at them, his face turning pale. His mask of a successful developer shattered. He tried to speak, to spin a lie about cash flow, but the words died. How much? Maya asked. Her voice was terrifyingly calm. Ethan swallowed, looking at his reflection. 400,000, he whispered. It grows every week. The sportsbooks don't renegotiate. They want cash now. Maya stood still, processing the collapse of her world. You tried to steal from your sister to save yourself. You trashed your grandmother's house while she was living there. I was desperate, Ethan pleaded. Reaching for her, she stepped away. Cynthia has a plan, Maya. A New York developer wants to turn the estate into a luxury resort. They're re-offering $12 million in cash, closing in 7 days. Maya narrowed her eyes. The estate is in probate. She can't sell a thing without a clear title. Ethan shook his head. Cynthia told them she holds the deed. They're re-rushing the search, but it depends on the property being vacant. If Megan stays in that cottage, the deal dies. Cynthia needs her gone by the end of the week. And how does she plan to do that? Maya demanded. Ethan stared at his drink. She isn't waiting for the clause to expire. She's hiring private security. They were going to evict Megan for trespassing. They'll drag her off that mountain tonight. The kitchen went deathly quiet. Ethan looked at his wife, waiting for her to defend him. He was wrong. Maya grabbed her diamond ring and wedding band. I married an ambitious man, she said softly. I didn't marry a coward. She pulled the rings off her finger. Ethan stepped forward, pure panic finally breaking through. Listen! If this deal closes, I can pay off the group, we can reset. Maya dropped her rings. Platinum bands hit the marble, a sharp metallic finality echoing in the quiet kitchen, like a period at the end of a long, brutal sentence. I am filing for divorce in the morning." Maya didn't flinch. "Do not contact my office." She walked out, leaving him with his bourbon and broken promises. Maya drove into the freezing night, her truck tearing up the icy access road toward the estate. She bypassed Cynthia's abandoned SUV, navigating the treacherous path with reckless speed. She reached the old cottage just before midnight. I was reading by the fire when she started hammering on the heavy oak door. I threw the bolt, shaken by the sheer violence of it. Maya stumbled inside, gasping for air. "They are coming tonight," she warned, shoving past me to re-engage the heavy iron deadbolt. Ethan confessed everything. Cynthia found a developer. "They need the land empty to close a $12 million deal. She hired contractors to drag you out." I felt my blood run cold. Julian warned me she would escalate, but I expected lawyers, not mercenaries. "We need to call the police," I said, grabbing my phone. Maya shook her head, pacing the floor. "The sheriff won't touch a civil estate dispute, especially with Cynthia holding the primary will. They will just call it an eviction. By the time my attorney files an injunction, you will have been off the property for 24 hours, and the trust will dissolve. You cannot leave this cabin." She was right. The residency clause was brutal. If I set 1 foot off the property line, even by force, the holdings would vanish. Cynthia would win. I looked around the room, 3 centuries old. Built to weather any storm, thick timber walls and narrow windows, a fortress. I grabbed the heavy splitting maul by the hearth. Maya pulled an antique cast-iron chair from the corner. Together, we shoved the massive oak table across the floor, wedging it tight beneath the door handle. We stacked benches against it, creating a barricade. We nailed the window sashes shut until the cottage felt like a tomb. We huddled by the hearth as the fire hissed in the silence. We waited. The minutes crawled. The adrenaline faded, replaced by cold dread. Maya sat with her knees to her chest. I saw her bare finger, no ring. I didn't ask. Her being here, risking everything to protect me, said it all. She had chosen family over blood. She was on the right side of this war. Then the stillness snapped through the window. I saw high-intensity headlights slice through the dark. The lights cut through the trees, strobing against the snow. The deep, guttural growl of heavy engines vibrated through the floor. Maya gripped my arm, her eyes reflecting the orange firelight. The vehicles stopped in the clearing, just past the porch. The engines idled, a menacing rumble shaking the foundation. I heard the slam of heavy truck doors, then the sound deliberate, unhurried, tactical boots crunching on frozen snow, rhythmic, terrifying footsteps heading straight for the porch. No knocking, they were here to breach. Cynthia had launched her final offensive, and there was nowhere left to run. The boots stopped at the base of the stairs. Maya and I sat still, firelight casting long, trembling shadows against the walls. I clutched the iron maul, knuckles white, ready for the door to splinter. The silence was agonizing. Then a sound that chilled me, not a violent kick. 3 sharp, polite knocks. A voice called out, muffled by the wood. "Megan Hall." "My name is Arthur Vance. I am here for your Aunt Cynthia Hall. I have authorization to inventory the artifacts inside." Maya and I exchanged a confused look. The tension snapped, replaced by total bewilderment. They didn't send muscle to drag me out. They sent an appraiser. I told Maya to stay put and cracked the door open. A man stood on the porch, lit by the headlights of a black luxury SUV. He wore a tailored wool coat and expensive leather gloves. He looked ridiculous in the Vermont wild. He gave a tight, practiced smile and held up a clipboard. "Good evening," Arthur said, his tone slick. "Sorry for the late hour, but the pending estate sale requires an urgent inventory. Cynthia hired me to value the antique loom and textiles for a Manhattan auction." The plan clicked into place. Cynthia realized a physical eviction would trigger police and criminal charges. She chose institutional warfare instead, a Trojan horse. This man wasn't here to look at a loom. He was a corporate spy here to find the ledger and photograph everything to see how much power I really had. "I am an appraiser too, Arthur," I said, standing my ground. "You know, ethical guidelines forbid appraisals in a blizzard." In the dark, without any environmental controls, he gave a patronizing chuckle. I understand the conditions, but my client is motivated. I just need a few moments. It would be a shame to report that you blocked a lawful estate inventory. He was threatening me with a breach of contract. If I locked him out, Cynthia would claim I was sabotaging the liquidation, voiding my trust. She had me cornered. I pulled the door open. Maya watched from the fire, unmoving. Arthur stepped inside, eyes darting everywhere except for the loom. He looked at the floorboards, the shelves, and my bag. "Fascinating architecture," he murmured. He reached into his coat and pulled out a high-resolution camera, not a magnifying loupe or UV light. He moved toward a wooden chest. A delicate 17th-century silk panel, brought from Venice decades ago, was draped over the top. It was incredibly fragile. The metallic threads were sensitive to the oils on human skin. Arthur reached out with a bare hand to flip the fabric. "Do not touch that," I snapped. My voice cracked like a whip. He paused, smirk on his lips. "I need to examine the warp and weft, Megan. It is standard procedure." My fury burned hotter than the fire. I stepped close, invading his space. "If you knew anything about 17th century silk, Arthur, you would know it uses silver gilt thread on a silk core," I hissed. "You know the oils from your hands will ruin those metallic elements. You know you need nitrile gloves, proper light, and a clean surface." Arthur's smirk faltered. He stepped back. "You are not an appraiser," I said, pressing the attack. "You are a corporate spy looking for a leather ledger, but you made a mistake. You stepped into my domain." I pointed a finger at him. "The New York antiquities community is small and protective. If I make one call tomorrow describing how you tried to handle museum-quality silk with your bare hands, your reputation is toast. You will never work in a gallery or auction house again. You will be blacklisted." The color drained from his face. His confidence vanished, replaced by pure panic. He knew better than to treat me like some naive girl in the woods. He was talking to a professional who could dismantle his entire career. Arthur stuttered, eyes darting to the door. "Cynthia is paying me," he claimed. "She said you were hiding family papers. She told me to photograph them for her legal defense." "She played you," I said. "Go back empty-handed and she will dump you and deny you ever existed. But I have a deal." Arthur swallowed hard, his camera shaking. "What kind of deal?" I walked to the table and pulled a manila folder from my bag. It was filled with fake, heavily redacted financial records I had made days ago. I had cooked the spreadsheets to look like Beatrice lost her fortune in bad investments right before she died. The papers made it look like the estate was bankrupt, with nothing left but the land. I pushed the fakes across the table. "Tell Cynthia. You searched the cottage during the storm," I told him. "Say you found these under a floorboard. Photograph them and get them to her tonight." Arthur stared at the folder. His mind was clearly racing. "Why would I give her fake files? Because if you do exactly what I say, I will forget you ever stepped inside this house. I promised you keep your pay. You keep your reputation and walk away from this hall. Family mess for good, refuse, and I will ruin you by morning." He did not hesitate. He picked up his camera and adjusted the lens. He snapped photos of every page of that fake ruin, the flash strobing through the dark cottage. Once finished, he tucked the camera away. "I will tell her this is all I found," Arthur said. "All his arrogance was gone. See yourself out." I told him. He bolted out the door and scrambled down the porch. His SUV engine roared to life, and he backed out, speeding down the mountain. Maya approached the table, staring at where the folders had been. "That was a massive risk," she said. "What happens when Cynthia sees those photos?" I looked at the hearth as the logs turned to ash. "When Cynthia sees those photos, she will believe Beatrice died with nothing. She will think Granite Holdings is just an empty shell. She will panic, and a panicked woman, Maya realized, makes reckless mistakes." "Exactly," I said. "Cynthia thinks she is out of time. She will drop all caution and rush that illegal sale to pay her creditors. She is walking right into the trap. We just have to wait for the final day." Day 30 broke over the Vermont mountains with blinding clarity. The storm had left the forest covered in ice that glittered like shattered glass in the sun. I stood by the stone fireplace, watching the last birch logs turn to ash. The Saltbox cottage was freezing, but I barely felt it. The residency clause was met. I had survived the digital smear, the burglary, and the corporate spy. The trap was sprung. I grabbed the heavy leather ledger from the table and locked the brass clasp one. Last time, I shoved it into my canvas bag next to the fake documents. I used to trick Arthur Vance. I pushed the heavy oak door open and stepped out. The world was dead silent. I did not look back. My work here was done. I started down the mountain. The access road was packed hard by recent traffic. The hike took less than 30 minutes. As I reached the lower trees, the forest silence broke under the low thrum of heavy machinery. Through the pines, I spotted the iron gates of the main hall estate. A fleet of commercial vehicles sat in the driveway, yellow excavators, flatbed trucks, and sleek black executive sedans. Cynthia did not waste a second. Buying the fake photos Arthur delivered, she assumed the estate was her only asset left and rushed to lock in the $12 million sale to Eka Resort developers. Before her creditors could seize the brand, I stepped out of the trees onto the paved driveway. Cynthia stood by a pristine black Range Rover, wearing a tailored crimson coat that screamed control. Two men in sharp charcoal suits stood across from her with legal closing papers. One handed her a gold fountain pen. Ethan stood a few feet back, shifting nervously as he glared at the idling excavators. He needed this sale to cover his gambling debts today. I kept walking, my leather boots hitting the pavement with a steady, rhythmic thud. I veered onto the frozen grass bordering the drive. My boot crunched a dry birch twig. The snap sounded like a gunshot in the crisp morning air. Cynthia froze, her hand hovering over the signature line. She turned slowly, her hair catching the winter light. When she saw me, the colour drained from her face, leaving her pale and hollow against that crimson coat. "Megan?" she breathed, shocked. "You were supposed to be on the mountain. I am 30 days past the will reading, Cynthia," I said, my voice cutting over the rumble of the engines. "The residency clause is done." Ethan stepped forward, his cowardice turning to panic. "You cannot be here. We are finalizing a private deal. You have no standing." Before I could speak, the crunch of tires on gravel drew our eyes to the gate. A silver sedan pulled up, followed by a plain white van. Julian Pierce stepped out, smoothing his charcoal suit. Two men in dark windbreakers climbed out of the van with cold, professional faces. They were process servers. Julian walked straight toward the Range Rover, ignoring Ethan and stopping feet away from the developers. "Gentlemen," Julian announced, his voice booming over the tension. "I am Julian Pierce, executor of the Beatrice Hall estate. I suggest you put your pens down." The lead developer frowned, looking confused. "We are executing a standard title transfer. Mr. Pierce?" "Cynthia Hall is the primary beneficiary. She holds the deed." Cynthia gripped the car hood, knuckles white. "I have the probate papers. Mother left the estate to me. It is public record." Julian opened his leather briefcase. He ignored the probate papers and pulled out the crisp, watermarked paper I had seen at the diner. He laid it right over Cynthia's contract. "The primary will dictates the property distribution," Julian explained, cool and clinical. "However, Beatrice Hall established a blind trust, Granite Holdings, 20 years ago. The deed to this land, the structures, and even this driveway were moved into that trust before she died." Cynthia stared at the document, her eyes scanning the legal text as the reality hit her with terrifying speed. "The trust," she stammered. "Arthur told me the trust was empty. He showed me the records." "Arthur Vance is an idiot who handled a silk brocade without gloves," I snapped, moving closer. "He showed you fake papers I created just to make you panic. You believed them because you were desperate." The developer stepped away, his confusion turning to pure fury. He pointed at Cynthia. "You swore the title was clear. You signed a letter claiming full ownership." Cynthia opened her mouth, but nothing came out. She looked to Ethan for help, but my brother was staring at the process servers, trembling. "If you sign that," Julian told the developers, "you are committing fraud. Granite Holdings holds the master deed." "Cynthia Hall has zero legal power to sell a single blade of grass here." The lead developer snatched the closing papers from under Julian's watermarked document. He glared at Cynthia. You just tried to pull federal wire fraud with our capital. Our legal team will be in touch about the due diligence fees you wasted." He turned and marched to his black sedan. "Pack it up," he yelled to the excavator operator. "We are leaving." The heavy machinery roared and shifted into reverse. The trucks and sedans began to file out of the gates, a loud, chaotic retreat that left Cynthia alone by her Range Rover. She looked at the gold pen in her hand, then dropped it. It rolled under the tire. She slumped against the car, gasping for air. Her luxury mask shattered, leaving a broken woman in a crimson coat. Ethan realized the game was up, his funding was dead. The cash he needed to pay the syndicates gone. He turned to me, hands up in a desperate, pathetic gesture. "Megan?" "Please," he begged, voice cracking. "You do not get it. They have so much leverage on me, they will take everything. You have to help. We are family." He stepped toward me, but a figure blocked his path. It was Maya. She had followed us in her sedan and watched the whole confrontation. She stood between us, posture rigid, dark eyes cold. "You do not get to use that word anymore, Ethan," she snapped, voice sharp and steady. She pulled a thick manila envelope from her pocket. She did not hand it over. She pressed it against his chest, forcing him to take it. "These are your final separation papers," Maya told him. "My lawyer filed them an hour ago. Keep the offshore debt and the syndicate threats. I am keeping my self-respect." Ethan stared at the envelope, his world crumbling. Maya turned and stood by me. The threat was gone. The illegal sale stopped. The estate was secure. Julian Pierce offered me a rare, genuine nod. "The residency clause is satisfied, Megan. The trust is officially active." I walked past Cynthia, who was still staring blankly at the snow. I ignored Ethan, who clung to those divorce papers like a lifeline. I marched up the wide stone steps to the main house entrance. I pulled the heavy brass key from my pocket and turned the lock. The mechanism clicked. I pushed the door open, stepping in not as the rejected niece, but as the rightful owner of the Hall family empire. I left that bitter Vermont morning behind. The foyer smelled of lemon oil and old wood, just like my childhood. This silence was different, not the quiet of being ignored, but the stillness of a vacant throne. Julian Pierce followed closely, leather briefcase in hand, his dress shoes clicking against the marble floor. We walked past the staircase and into the library. Beatrice spent her final years in this room. Floor-to-ceiling shelves held thousands of rare books. A massive Persian rug anchored the space, centered around a sprawling antique partner's desk. Julian set his briefcase down and unlatched it. "The time for playing defense is over," he said, pulling out a thick stack of watermarked documents. I stood near the windows overlooking the driveway. Outside, Cynthia and Ethan looked tiny against the massive property they had tried to steal. "You have satisfied the residency clause," Julian continued, laying the papers flat. "It is time to activate Grant Holdings." I walked to the desks. The documents were dense with legal text transferring full executive authority. Julian handed me a small velvet box. Inside was a vintage 1950s fountain pen. It was a Parker Vacuumatic, its pearlescent barrel gleaming. Beatrice used this exact pen for her most critical contracts. I unscrewed the cap. The gold nib caught the morning light. I pressed the tip against the heavy parchment. Black ink flowed perfectly, tracking my signature across the final line. In one stroke, everything changed. I was no longer an outcast fighting for a drafty cottage. I was the chief executive officer of a multi-million-dollar trust. I held the reins of an empire. "We need a comprehensive audit," I commanded, my voice steady. "Bring me the UCC-1 filings and the asset schedules." Julian pulled a secondary folder from his case. He handed me detailed financial ledgers. I set up my base of operations at the mahogany desk. I was an appraiser. I was trained to find the truth in the microscopic details. I applied that same logic to my family history. For hours, I cross-referenced the ledger from the cottage with Julian S. legal documents. The picture that emerged was a masterpiece of financial leverage. Beatrice had not been generous. She had engineered a brilliant system of control. Every dollar she gave to Cynthia, Ethan and Chloe was secured by airtight pledge agreements. She owned the majority equity in Cynthia S. Brand. She held the primary liens on Ethan S. real estate. She possessed the voting rights for Chloe S. Media Company. I looked at my signature sitting beside Beatrice red annotations. My grandmother S. plan finally clicked. She did not leave me this trust just to secure my future. She could have left me cash if she wanted that. She left me Granite Holdings because she knew the money was poison. It had turned her own family into entitled parasites. She did not leave me wealth. She left me the legal power to discipline. A broken family. I hold the voting rights to Cynthia's company. I noted, tracing the spreadsheet. Julian nodded. You control the board. You can freeze her accounts immediately. And Ethan's properties? I asked, turning the page. The liens give you priority over his creditors. Julian confirmed. You can force the liquidation of his assets before the syndicates ever see a dime. I leaned back in the chair. The power was absolute. I could dismantle their lives with a few phone calls. Prepare the notices, I ordered. Julian opened a portable printer he had brought. He connected it to his encrypted laptop. The machine hummed to life. Over the next hour, it churned out formal corporate documents. These were not polite requests. They were aggressive, uncompromising notices of default and asset seizure. Julian pulled the final page from the printer. He collated the stack and placed it on the desk. He reached into his briefcase for a heavy brass stamp and a stick of red wax. He melted the wax over the corner of the top document and pressed the stamp into the cooling resin. The Granite Holdings crest remained a stark, formal seal of authority. The notices are ready, Julian said softly. I placed my hand on the stack. The wax was still warm. The gravity of the moment hit me. These documents were the nuclear codes I had been hiding in the cottage. They held the power to destroy my own blood. My phone buzzed on the desk. It was Chloe. She had stayed silent in Boston while the others tried to evict me. Now, the news of the blocked sale had reached her. I picked up the device. Megan, Chloe's voice sounded frantic. The influencer persona was completely stripped away. Cynthia just called me in hysterics, she said. You stopped the sale. And Julian brought out a blind trust. What is happening? I looked at the seizure notices. Chloe, I said, my voice cold, check your mail tomorrow morning. I hung up before she could respond. The defensive war was over. I picked up the sealed documents, ready to go on the offensive. I walked toward the library doors, the parchment secure in my grip. It was time to show them exactly what happens when you underestimate the quiet girl. Julian Pierce operated with a lethal efficiency honed over 30 years of corporate warfare. He did not use standard mail. He utilized a network of specialized process servers to ensure the delivery was legally binding and publicly undeniable. The offensive began on a Tuesday. I sat at the library desk, authenticating a 17th century tapestry, while the traps snapped shut across 3 states. Cynthia received her notice at the flagship location of her brand in Manhattan. The server walked straight into her high-profile meeting with investors. He bypassed the receptionist, walked into the glass-walled conference room, and dropped the red-sealed folder on the table. The terms were brutal. Per the pledge agreements, she had 4 days to repay over $4 million. If she failed, Granite Holdings would seize her inventory, trademarks, and accounts. Ethan was served at a golf tournament in Connecticut. He was on the 18th green, charming regional bankers for a loan. When the server handed him the notice, it spelled out immediate lines on his properties, freezing his assets unless I gave the green light. Only Sarah got hers at home. The server skipped the building concierge, heading straight to her penthouse door. It demanded immediate repayment of the emergency cash. Aunt Beatrice wired over 5 years, backed by her home equity. By Wednesday, the certified mail receipts hit my mahogany desks. A satisfying thud, the sound of total victory. They were served. The 2-week clock started ticking, and chaos erupted. No coordinated defense, just pure, frantic panic as they scrambled to save themselves. Sarah struck back first. Using her massive digital following, she went live from her penthouse. No makeup, just a plain grey hoodie, the classic devastated victim look. She sobbed for 20 minutes, claiming a jealous relative tricked our dying grandmother into signing away the fortune. She painted a picture of abuse and extortion, begging followers for help. She really underestimated the team in my library. Maya had just joined my operation. After handing her husband divorce papers, Maya ditched structural engineering to run PAR and strategy for my firm. She watched Sarah stream stone-faced. "Time to take down this influencer," she said, her fingers blurring across her keyboard. Maya didn't argue back. She launched a precision digital strike. She used IP logs to prove the smear campaign against my business came right from Sarah's house. Then she paired that with the hidden non-disclosure agreements, the ones showing Beatrice paying off designers Sarah had blatantly ripped off. Maya packaged it all into a perfect digital dossier and fired it off to Sarah's corporate sponsors and every major fashion journalist. The fallout was instant. Within hours, her main cosmetic sponsor cut ties, citing a zero-tolerance policy for theft. Fashion blogs blew up, exposing the agreements. Sarah went from victim to total fraud. Her followers vanished. She deleted the stream and went dark. Her career was dead by sundown. Dave-esque's collapse was quieter, but just as brutal. His business was all about the appearance of cash. Once bankers saw him served on the golf course, rumours of his money troubles spread through the industry like wildfire. His partners ran an emergency audit and found the filings. They realised his investments weren't his own, but debt from a trust he didn't even control. They invoked the morality clauses, kicked him out of the group, and cut off all project funding. Dave was left with unfinished buildings and zero cash. With loan sharks closing in, he was completely trapped. Only Brenda tried to fight back legally. She hired a pit bull lawyer in Manhattan to stop the clock, claiming the pledges were signed under duress and my company was a sham. Julian saw it coming. He immediately filed the 3 mental health evaluations Beatrice had done before starting the trust. The reports were rock solid, confirming Beatrice was sharp as a tack. The judge tossed Brenda's petition, ordered her to pay the legal fees, and the 2 weeks ran out. The family went deathly silent. No more threats, no more spies. They had nothing left, shattered by the weight of the law. On the 14th night, freezing rain hammered the state. I sat in the library, reviewing the documents to transfer their assets to me at midnight. The clock struck 11. Less than an hour left. Then a sharp buzz cut through the quiet. I looked up. The intercom at the main gate was flashing red. Julian set his pen down. Maya stopped typing. I hit the button. It was Megan. Her voice was thin, ragged, all that arrogance completely gone. Barely audible over the storm, she begged, "Please open the gate." I checked the monitor. The floodlights hit the iron gates. There they were, Brenda and Dave, soaked to the bone and shivering in the downpour. No luxury SUVs. They'd come in a local taxi that was already pulling away, leaving them stranded. No luggage, no legal folders. They had come to surrender. I clicked off the intercom, letting silence fill the room. The war had reached my door. I hit the gate release. The heavy iron groaned, and the entrance swung open. From the window, I watched them trudge up the long drive. Rain lashed at them. No umbrellas. Heads bowed against the wind. It took 10 agonizing minutes to reach the steps. I stayed at my desk. Julian stood by the fire, calm. Maya watched from the corner. We didn't greet them. We let them walk into the hall alone. The library doors pushed open. They stepped in, dripping water onto the hardwood. A month ago they sat here with such entitlement. Brenda in designer cashmere, Dave in tailored wool. Now, their clothes were ruined, soaked through by the storm. Brenda gripped her handbag. She shivered violently, and the bag slipped from her wet shoulder. It hit the floor with a hollow plastic thud, not the heavy, muted sound of real leather, a cheap knockoff. That cheap noise said everything, a pathetic replica, just like her, hitting rock bottom. Dave spoke first, wiping rain from his eyes. His voice was shaking, devoid of its usual smooth edge. He said my name. He told me the syndicates were hunting him. He said his partners had locked him out of everything. He begged me to release the liens just long enough for a bridge loan. He pulled the sibling card, using the word family like a magic spell to erase the last month. He said, "Family has to protect family." I didn't move. I listened to the rain against the glass, thinking about the pry bar he once used to break into my cottage. I let his desperate plea hang in the air until the silence was deafening. He flinched. Sarah stepped forward, trying to command the room, but her teeth chattered. She claimed Grandma never meant for the inheritance to be used this way. She insisted Mother loved them, then begged me to forgive their loans. She even promised me a seat at her Thanksgiving table in exchange for her company. I stayed calm. I didn't need to yell. I just reached across the mahogany desk and pulled the heavy leather ledger toward me. The brass lock was open. As I flipped the pages, the sharp scent of peppermint oil filled the library, cutting through the smell of damp wool. They stared, terrified of the book they knew would destroy them. I turned to Sarah's section. I scanned her massive debts written in black ink, then focused on the harsh red ink in the margins. I looked at my aunt and told her I wasn't looking at finances. I was looking at her moral bankruptcy. I started reading. I read the dates. Grandma wired her emergency cash. I read the exact words Grandma used when she asked her daughter to stay for tea. I read how Sarah claimed her driver was waiting. I looked Sarah in the eye. That tea went cold years ago. You don't owe $200,000, Sarah, I said. You owe 52 missed dinners and 100 abandoned cups of tea, and the firm is collecting. She opened her mouth to argue, but the words died. Her face turned ghost white. I turned the page to Mark's section. I found a note from 3 years ago. Grandma paid off his gambling debts so he wouldn't get hurt. Instead of visiting her in the hospital for pneumonia that weekend, Mark bought a luxury sports car. You don't owe a real estate lien, Mark, I told him. You owe her the hospital visits you skipped to play. Pretend. He looked at his ruined shoes. No defense, no leverage left. I slammed the ledger shut. I told them family isn't a shield for when you get caught. I pointed to Alina in the corner. I told them family is the person who actually cared, while you two treated Grandma like an ATM. You treated me like a peasant for a month. Now, pay up. Sarah broke. It wasn't the fake crying she used to fool everyone else. It was a jagged, ugly sob. She collapsed onto her knees, shaking as tears mixed with the freezing rain on her face. She realized her manipulation tactics were useless. No charm, no guilt, just an immovable wall. She begged me not to take her company, saying it was all she had. I felt nothing but cold resolve. I told her the firm wasn't forgiving a single cent. The 14-day clock had run out. The takeover was active. The liens were executed. They would pay back every penny they stole. Mark made a hollow sound, realizing the road had ended. Then I pulled out a new stack of papers. I wasn't throwing them on the street to be hunted by gamblers. I had a restructuring plan. They were going to work off their debts starting tomorrow. The morning sun hit the library floor. Julian arrived at 8 with the contracts. No more begging, the storm had passed, leaving behind an unforgiving frost. Now it was just time for the math. They sat there looking small and fragile in borrowed sweaters. No designer labels, no arrogance. I didn't offer coffee. I just slid the first document toward my older brother. Mark had a talent for real estate, but he wasted it on flashy deals to impress his friends. I wasn't stripping his ability to work, just his unearned status. The firm took the titles to his properties. Julian handled the sale of his sports cars to pay off the dangerous gambling debts. Mia stepped up to present the divorce papers. Mark didn't argue. He picked up a pen. He signed his name, ending his marriage with a shaking hand. No alimony, no assets to pay his debt. I got him a spot on a local construction framing crew. He was done being a high-rise developer. Now he was a junior contractor pouring concrete in the biting cold. Most of his check went straight to the firm. He traded his suits for steel-toed boots. He would learn what $1 is actually worth. Sarah was harder. Her whole life was a lie. I authorized this hostile takeover of her company by noon. The audit confirmed exactly what I suspected. She used cheap, exploitative factories overseas while pretending to sell organic luxury goods. I told Maya to leak the audit to the fashion press. Her stores closed within hours. The fake empire vanished, leaving only her massive debt. I gave her one path, manual labor. I set her up in a remote cottage with a loom. She used to mock my work as a hobby. Now she would learn true craftsmanship. She had to weave authentic textiles from raw wool. I set a wage and kept 80% to pay down her debt. I drove her up the mountain in my beat-up car. The snow was deep. She stared out the window, pale and terrified. I unlocked the isolated cabin. The loom sat in the center of the room. I gave her a manual on colonial weaving and a pile of wool. I explained her daily quotas. She touched the wood of the loom, finally realizing her new life had begun. She would spend her days in the isolation she once planned for me. I left her by the hearth and drove back down. The ledger was waiting on the desk. I touched the binding. The scent of peppermint rose up. A memory of Grandma sitting in this room. She used this book as a witness to their greed. I used it to cut the rot from our family. It was finished. I shoved the heavy ledger into the library. Safe turned the dial, clicked the lock shut. Then I pulled the tarnished brass key out and tucked it deep inside my desk. No more hidden debts. Maya was at the drafting table, mapping out a new path. We had cut the parasites loose. Now it was time to build something real. Our firm, Granite Holdings, needed a new mission. We turned the old estate into a historical restoration center. Maya used her genius to design climate-controlled vaults in the guest wing. I used my connections to land contracts with top museums and collectors. We became the go-to experts for antique preservation. We built a real business, hiring honest, hard-working researchers and textile pros. The mansion used to reek of entitlement. Now it hummed with actual work. The war was over. We decleaned the wound, fixed the legacy, and set the rules. 1 year later, the mountain air felt different. The tension at the estate simply vanished. We named it the Beatrice Center for Textile Preservation. The house no longer echoed with fake boasts or designer heels. It smelled like cedar and archival paper. Maya stood in the east wing, blueprints in hand. She was overseeing a new humidity control system, blending modern glass into the original timber frame with total precision. Maya didn't just survive the divorce, she rebuilt from the ground up. Without that deadweight husband, her career soared. She was a partner now, commanding the room with total, quiet authority. In the lab, our team worked on Civil War linens and rare tapestries. We were thriving, built on transparency and grit. Down in the valley, Ethan was a year into his framing job. Maya got a photo of him. Ethan looked rough, faded jacket, weather-beaten face, working hard. He paid his debts on time, every time. He lived in a tiny studio, broke and tired. But for once, actually honest, I left the house late in the day. The driveway, once a battlefield blocked by a luxury car, was now a quiet gravel road. The air had that sharp, crisp autumn bite. I carried a thermos and a small bag up the hill toward the cottage. I stopped by the tree line, watching through the window. It was warm inside. Cynthia sat there, focused on an antique oak loom. She threw the wooden shuttle, pulling the bar with a steady, rhythmic snap. Her hands weren't manicured. Anymore they were rough, stained deep with dark indigo and natural dyes. Wearing a plain sweater, she caught a snag in the thread. A year ago, she would have screamed at someone to fix it. Today she just leaned in and painstakingly rethreaded it herself. She looked exhausted, but as she checked her work, she stood taller. No more performing for an audience. She was making something real. She was paying her debt yard by yard. I walked onto the porch. I took a seat in the chair facing the woods. I pulled out my bag and grabbed the old chipped mug with the cardinal on it, Beatrice's favourite. I poured hot water over some fresh mint. The steam hit the cold air, smelling like peppermint and pine. I held the warm ceramic. The mountain was peaceful. Everything finally made sense. The master plan was clear. True inheritance isn't a bank account or a fancy deed. Those are just tools, and in the wrong hands, they're poison. Beatrice knew that wealth without discipline just creates parasites. My grandmother left me a broken home and a circle of enemies. She pushed me to the edge because she knew real power is built when no one is watching. She gave me the strength to hold my ground. I didn't win because of luck. I won because I could sit in the dark and outlast the winter. And I am telling you this, if you've ever been handed an empty envelope by your own family, if you've ever been mocked for your choices by people living hollow lives. Listen, sometimes a lump of coal is actually a diamond. Being underestimated is a superpower. Build your walls and guard them. I have 3 rules from those 30 days in the dark. 1, blood is just biology, not a free pass. You don't owe your table to anyone who disrespects you. 2, forgiveness is yours, but reconciliations must be earned. You can drop the anger without letting them back in. 3, your worth isn't set by people who can't afford your price. I sipped the tea. The estate below me was finally safe. The loom kept clicking, measuring out honest time. The ledger was locked away. The debt was being paid. I closed my eyes and listened to the wind in the pines. It was all exactly right. We like our family dinners and perfect holiday photos. We build these traditional structures thinking that a big house and a trust fund equal good parenting. We kill ourselves working to give our kids everything. But behind the picture-perfect life, there is often a secret ledger. It's not about money. It's about the slights, the cold comparisons, and the devastating silence of being ignored. Through intense family sagas, our stories expose the damage of parental favoritism and offer a vital lesson for families everywhere. Love should never be a scoreboard. We live in a culture that judges a child by their resume rather than their character. Neglecting a child today leaves a scar that can last a lifetime. It is a quiet, hidden trauma that warps how they see the world. Kids praised only for their status learn that love is just a contract, leading to hollow entitlement. Meanwhile, the child dismissed for choosing a different path feels worthless. We want to urge parents to listen, be fair, and own their responsibility for their child's emotional health. Society needs to stop treating family trauma as just a normal part of life. We have to stop ignoring the pain of the unfavored child. Sometimes, what a kid needs isn't a massive bank account, it is just knowing they matter as much as their siblings. This is the heart of the lesson we are sharing today. True wealth is not in a bank balance, but in skills and integrity. When we shelter kids from the reality of hard work or fix every mistake with cash and angry phone calls, we destroy their resilience. We rob them of the pride that comes from building something with their own hands. A parent's real job isn't handing a child a pre-built empire, but teaching them how to build their own foundation. It is about valuing honest effort. Wealth without discipline and real work is just a poison. It rots the next generation's moral compass and leaves them lost when real life hits. But the biggest failure is when we swap money for our own presence. Think about that. Every time a parent ignores a child's feelings or pays for their absence with cash, it leaves a mark on that child's soul. This is the real debt. It is the school play traded for a meeting and a shiny new gadget. It is the cry for help answered with a check instead of an actual conversation. It is the tragedy of a child walking away because they are too busy with the life you bought for them. Don't let the tea get cold because you were too busy chasing status. That cold cup is a moment of connection you can never buy back. Emotional fairness is what makes a child feel truly loved. So, how do we heal when the family structure breaks? We have to redefine what kinship means. Our stories looks beyond blood ties and focuses on loyalty and presence. Society says blood is everything, but Megan has 3 rules to help you heal from toxic family patterns. First, sharing DNA does not give anyone the right to hurt you. Blood is biological, not a free pass to ignore your boundaries or crush your spirit. Second, reconciliation is impossible without real behavioral change. Forgiveness is for you, but rebuilding a relationship takes work from them. You can forgive a parent or sibling to find your own peace, but you don't have to let them back in unless they have done the work to change. Third, your self-worth is your business. Never let people who don't see your value tell you who you are. You own that narrative. These aren't just rules for survival. They are the blueprint for a healthier, more aware generation. To raise kids who are whole, we have to look closely at our own choices. We must ask ourselves what we are actually teaching through our actions and whose pain we ignore to keep things quiet. If this story touched you, please subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments. We are committed to stories that pull back the curtain and celebrate the hard-won victories of real integrity. Tonight, look at your family and try to see past the performance. Listen to the silences. Are the teacups growing cold? If you had to read a ledger of every emotional transaction in your life, would you have the guts to face the red ink?